I accepted a position in the Vatican's Crypt division, believing my greatest challenge would be translating forgotten texts. They gave me 5 simple rules for working in the darkness beneath St. Peter's, assuring me they were for my safety. I soon learned the rules were not a shield for me, but a cage for something else, a cage whose lock has just been shattered. Now, the silence from the deep has been broken, and the only thing more terrifying than the secrets we've uncovered is the truth of what is coming for us all. My office is older than most countries, and it smells of beeswax, brittle paper, and something else, the faint mineral tang of deep earth that bleeds up from the stone below. When I accepted the post with the Vatican's Archival and Cryptographic Division, or as its handful of members call it, the Crypt Division, I imagined a life of scholarly quiet. I pictured myself translating forgotten papal bulls and cataloging relics, whose greatest threat was the slow, patient decay of time. I was a historian after all, not an exorcist. I was wrong. The work isn't done in my sun-dusted office. The real work happens beneath it, in the tiered levels of the Vatican secret archives that plunge into the earth, like the circles of Dante's hell. Before my first descent, I was summoned to the antechamber, a small, severe room of gray marble that serves as the only entrance. Waiting for me was Monsignor Valerio, the division's director. He was a thin man, swallowed by his cassock, with eyes that held the weary weight of secrets. But it was his hands I noticed first. They trembled, a constant palsied tremor that only ceased when he pressed his palms together as if in prayer. "Silas," he began, his voice a dry rustle, "before you take your first step down there, you must understand that you are not entering a library. You are entering a containment facility. Therefore, there are rules, not guidelines, not suggestions, rules." He held up a hand, his quivering fingers ticking off each point like a grim benediction. Rule number 1, you will never enter the crypts alone. There are no exceptions. Your partner is your lifeline. His eyes flicked to the heavy iron-banded door behind him. It is easy to get lost. That seemed practical enough. I nodded. Rule number 2, always carry blessed candles. The emergency lighting is reliable, but there are some shadows that electricity cannot reach. The candles are not for light. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach. Not for light? What then? Rule number 3, he continued, his gaze sharpening. Report any sensory distortion immediately, a sudden chill, a strange scent, a sound that has no source. Do not rationalize it, do not ignore it, report it. This was the first rule that felt truly strange, moving beyond practical safety into the realm of the uncanny. Sensory distortion. The phrase itself was unnerving. Rule number 4. Do not touch unmarked containers or read from uncatalogued texts. Some knowledge was sealed for a reason. Curiosity is not a virtue down there. It is a liability that can cost you more than your life. I was a scholar. My entire being was wired to investigate the unknown, to read the unread. This rule felt like a personal challenge, a command to deny my very nature. And finally, rule number 5, exit before midnight. The gates are sealed at the stroke of 12 and do not reopen until dawn. Be on this side of the door when that happens. He finished, and the silence in the room felt heavy, profound. He saw the questions in my eyes, the academic skepticism warring with a nascent fear. He offered a thin, tired smile that didn't reach his eyes. The official justifications are sound, of course. The lower levels are geologically unstable. Cave-ins are a remote but real possibility. The atmospheric pressure can affect sensitive equipment. Old bindings and pigments can release toxic particulates. He took a step closer, and the tremor in his hands seemed to intensify. He lowered his voice, and the feigned practicality vanished, replaced by a chilling gravity. His eyes, dark and haunted, locked onto mine. "But the rules are not for your safety, Silas," he whispered, the words hanging in the cold air like frost. "They are for your sanity." A genuine chill, unrelated to the room's temperature, traced a path down my spine. The words landed with the weight of a tombstone. For my sanity. Suddenly, the image of dusty shelves and forgotten history evaporated, replaced by a far darker picture. Just then, the door to the stairwell opened and my assigned partner stepped through. "Dr. Beatrice Vella," she said, her handshake firm and cool. She was a woman in her late 40s, with sharp, intelligent features and an air of professional calm that was both intimidating and reassuring. She looked like she had spent a lifetime in archives, but her eyes held none of the Monsignor's haunted depths. She was a seasoned professional, a steady hand, and yet, as she turned toward the spiraling stone staircase that led down into the gloom, I saw it. It was a gesture so small, so swift, it was meant to be unseen. Her thumb and forefingers moved in a tiny, automatic motion, tracing a fleeting sign of the cross over her heart, before she placed her hand on the cold iron railing. In that single, secret gesture, she told me everything I needed to know. The Monsignor's fear wasn't the rambling of an old man. It was real. It was present. And even a veteran like Dr. Vella felt the need for a shield against it. She glanced back at me, her expression unreadable. "Ready, Silas?" I nodded, my mouth too dry to speak. I took the blessed candles she offered, their waxy weight feeling both foolish and necessary in my hand. Together we began our descent, our footsteps echoing in the descending dark. The world of sunlight, tourists, and logic vanished behind us. We had entered the domain of the rules. The first week was a study in profound silence. Dr. Vella and I worked on the upper levels, 1 and 2, where the air was still cool and dry, smelling of ancient leather and dust. Our task was a historian's dream, cataloging a trove of unindexed medieval texts. We spent our days in pools of focused light from our battery-powered lamps, the vast darkness of the crypts pressing in just beyond the glow. The silence wasn't merely an absence of noise, it was a physical presence, a weight in the ears that swallowed the soft rasp of vellum pages and the quiet clicks of Vella's keyboard. We spoke only when necessary, our voices sounding small and intrusive in the immense quiet. Vella was the consummate professional. Her movements were economical and precise, her focus absolute. She treated the crypts like a laboratory, a place of work governed by protocols. Yet every day, I saw her perform that same fleeting sign of the cross before we descended, a silent acknowledgement of the Monsignor's warning. The rules, once strange, were becoming a quiet liturgy that structured our days. We never strayed far from one another. We refreshed the blessed candles whenever they burned low. We exited promptly at 11:45 p.m. It was a routine, and in its rhythm, I began to feel a fragile sense of security. We were on level 2, in a long, narrow chamber lined with shelves of dark, dense wood when it happened. I was reaching for a folio bound in faded blue hide, my mind occupied with its probable Coptic origins. One moment, the air was still and cool. The next, a chill unlike any I had ever felt sank into me. It wasn't a draft. It was an invasive, hungry cold that seemed to radiate from the stone itself, bypassing my coat and seeping directly into my bones. I froze, my hand hovering inches from the book. The air around me seemed to thicken, growing heavy and viscous, as if I were trying to breathe through fine syrup. And then I heard it. It was a crackle at the very edge of my hearing, a faint, distorted whisper that sounded like static trying to resolve into a word. It was directionless, seeming to come from inside my own head and the far corners of the chamber at once. I instinctively held my breath to listen, and as I did, I saw it. The pale, ghostly plume of my own exhalation, misting in the air before my face. "Rule number 3, I said, my voice coming out as a croak. The sound was horribly loud in the oppressive stillness. Vella looked up from her work, her expression immediately sharp. She didn't question me. She didn't hesitate. She simply unclipped a small digital thermometer from her belt and held it in the space between us. We watched in silence as the red digits flickered and dropped. 15 degrees Celsius, 12, 10. It settled at 8. A localized drop of 7 degrees. She noted the reading in her logbook with a steady hand. Location, Chamber 2 Gamma. Time, 14:32. Temperature anomaly confirmed. She looked at me, her gaze clinical but with a flicker of something else beneath it. Concern. Any other distortion? A sound, I said, feeling my heart hammer against my ribs. A whisper, like static. Vella's focus didn't waver. She stood perfectly still for a long moment, listening. The only sound was the faint, almost sub-audible hum of the deep earth dehumidifiers. "I don't hear anything, Silas," she said, her voice even. "Just the hum." She didn't say it with dismissal, but with a careful diagnostic tone that was somehow more unnerving. It was the way a doctor might speak to a patient describing a troubling hallucination. In her eyes, my account was now divided. One part validated by data, the other stranded in the realm of subjective, unverifiable experience. She keyed her radio. Vella took control. The voice that came back was crisp and immediate. "Go ahead, Dr. Vella." Reporting a Rule 3 event in Chamber 2 Gamma. Confirmed thermal distortion. Unconfirmed auditory phenomenon. Requesting instruction. There was no debate, no request for more data. The response was chillingly swift. "Understood. Evacuate Level 2 immediately. Both of you. Proceed to the surface. Your workday is over." We packed in silence, the bone-deep cold receding as quickly as it had arrived. As we walked back toward the main stairwell, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched by the deep, profound darkness that surrounded our small cones of light. The next morning we were summoned again to the Monsignor's antechamber. He looked as if he hadn't slept. The tremor in his hands was more pronounced than ever. "The maintenance team swept the chamber an hour ago," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "They found nothing. No draft, no atmospheric leak, no equipment malfunction. Nothing." He paused, his haunted gaze moving from me to Vella and back again. He looked down at his clasped hands, as if the sight of their trembling was a confirmation of some terrible truth. "The chamber has been resealed," he said, the words falling like dirt on a coffin. "The access corridor will be bricked over by sundown. It will not be opened again in your lifetime." The sealing of Chamber 2 Gamma was not a topic for discussion. It was a fact, as solid and final as the new brick wall that now blocked the corridor. Monsignor Valerio assigned us to a new task on Level 3, a place deeper and palpably older. The order was delivered with the same grim finality, as if he were sending us to a different, more ancient front in a war. One was only beginning to comprehend. The descent past Level 2 was a journey into another world. The dry, dusty air of the upper archives gave way to a profound dampness that clung to our clothes and chilled our skin. The air grew thick, heavy with the damp, earthy perfume of petrichor, the scent of stone that has not known sunlight for 1,000 years. But woven through it was another scent, something sharp and unsettling. It was an acrid, organic odor, the faint but persistent suggestion of old decay, of spilt sacraments and dried blood that had soaked into the very mortar between the stones. Vella, usually so composed, kept her hand closer to the radio on her belt, her shoulders tight. Our assigned space was a manuscript room at the end of a long, branching corridor, filled with scrolls stored in clay jars and codices bound in dark, unmarked leather. Here, the silence was different. It wasn't the sterile, weighted silence of Level 2, it was a listening silence, expectant and ancient. We worked for hours, the only sounds being the careful rustle of our movements and the soft whisper of Vella's brush cleaning a fragile spine. Then I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. It was a slow, deliberate rhythm. I paused, looking up at the vaulted stone ceiling, assuming it was a drip of water, a common enough sound in these deep places. But the sound was too dry, too distinct, and the rhythm was too perfect. It wasn't the random plink of condensation, it was measured, patient. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, the words feeling like a sacrilege. Vella went still, her head cocked. We listened. The crypt returned to its profound quiet. She gave a slight shake of her head, but her eyes were wary. A few minutes later, it came again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, it wasn't from above. It was from behind us, seemingly from the corridor we had just walked down. I turned in my chair, my lamp beam cutting a sharp, trembling arc into the darkness. There was nothing but the long, empty passage. As my light swept back, the sound came again, impossibly, from a side passage just ahead of us. It was moving. Or something was. It felt less like a sound and more like an announcement, a patient counting of beats, as if something were idly biding its time, waiting for us. We packed up an hour early, the unseen rhythm having shredded our concentration. The constant, patient tapping followed us as we began our return, sometimes echoing far behind, sometimes seeming to whisper right at our heels. The journey back, which should have been straightforward, began to unravel. An archway I swore had been rounded was now sharply pointed. The floor, once rough-hewn stone, became unnervingly smooth under our boots in one corridor, the walls slick and clammy to the touch, as if the rock itself were perspiring. "This is the wrong way," Vela stated, her voice tight with a control I knew was costing her. She consulted her compass, its needle trembling slightly in her hand. The main passage should have been on our left. We doubled back, but the junction we expected wasn't there. In its place was a circular chamber we had never seen before, its walls lined with empty, gaping alcoves. They looked less like storage spaces and more like waiting mouths. We turned around, retracing our steps with meticulous care, only to find ourselves, impossibly, standing in the very same circular room 10 minutes later. Panic, cold and sharp, began to needle at the edges of my composure. I stared at the floor, my mind racing. "There's a crack," I said, pointing with a shaking hand. "A fissure in the floor, right there. It wasn't here the first time." Vela knelt, her lamp illuminating a thin, dark line in the stone that looked disturbingly fresh. "That's not possible," she breathed, but her certainty was gone, replaced by the same dawning horror I felt. The crypt was no longer a static place. It was a living labyrinth, subtly reshaping itself when we weren't looking. We tried a third passage, moving faster now, the need to escape a burning urgency in my chest. And once again we found ourselves entering the same circular room. But this time a thick, velvety green moss now covered the southern wall in a pattern that looked almost like a spreading stain. The air was thick with the 3-beat tapping which now seemed to come from all directions at once, a soft, mocking applause for our fruitless efforts. We were caught. Trapped not by walls, but by a malevolent, shifting geometry. The rules were for our sanity, the Monsignor had said, and I could feel mine beginning to fray. We were trapped. The patient, 3-beat tapping echoed from the stones around us, a mocking metronome for our panic. 3 times we tried to find the main passage, and 3 times the living labyrinth of level 3 funneled us back into that same circular chamber, each time subtly, malevolently altered. Desperation began to curdle into a cold, quiet dread. There was only one path we hadn't taken, a dark, uninviting archway that seemed to drink the light from our lamps. It was our last resort. The moment my boot crossed the threshold, the tapping stopped. It didn't fade. It ceased, cut off so abruptly that the resulting silence was a shock, a sudden vacuum in the air. The corridor sloped gently downward, its floor and walls fashioned from a smoother, darker stone than the rest of the level. It was unmarked on our schematics, an undocumented artery leading deeper into the earth. Vela and I exchanged a look, the same unspoken thought passing between us. The silence was not a reprieve, it was a new kind of warning. We followed the sloping passage for what felt like an eternity, the air growing colder with every step. It ended abruptly, not in another chamber, but at a wall of solid rock. Set into it was a door, or rather a seal, a single, massive slab of dark, unadorned stone. There were no hinges, no handle, no keyhole, It was a permanent and final barrier. Faint, elegant script had been carved into its center. Dr. Vela, the epigrapher, stepped forward instinctively, her academic curiosity momentarily overriding her fear. She traced the lines of the inscription with her gloved fingertips as she read the Latin aloud, her voice a hushed, reverent whisper in the immense quiet. Quod simil signatum est, in aeternum maneat. She paused, translating for me. What is once sealed should remain forever sealed. As the last word left her lips, a spiderweb of crystalline frost bloomed on the stone beneath her fingers. It spread with an audible hiss, the sound of flash-frozen moisture, a stark white pattern against the black rock. Vela snatched her hand back as if burned, a sharp intake of breath cutting through the silence. We both stared, horrified. The ambient temperature was cool, but nowhere near freezing. Yet there it was, a physical, impossible reaction to her touch, a clear and immediate violation of the natural laws we understood. The door was not just a barrier, it was a warning imbued with a power that defied explanation. We needed no further encouragement. We turned without a word and hurried back up the sloping corridor, a frantic energy propelling us. The need to escape, to reach the surface, was a primal scream in my mind. Back in the shifting labyrinth of the main level, Vela didn't hesitate. She grabbed the radio from her belt. Vela to control. We are lost on level 3. The architecture is unstable, requesting immediate guidance. The radio crackled to life, but before the operator's familiar voice could respond, another sound forced its way through the speaker. It was the same sound I had heard in Chamber 2 Gamma, a rush of raw static, laced with a whispering hiss that felt parasitic, invasive. It was the sound of something unholy trying to push its way through the membrane of our world. Then, through the static, a single word erupted. It was perfectly clear, guttural, and ancient. It was a word spoken in a language I had never heard, yet it felt like it scraped against the inside of my skull. A syllable of pure malevolence that bypassed my ears and imprinted itself directly onto my brain. The violation lasted only a second. Immediately after, the operator's voice came through, clean and untroubled. Control to Vela, we have your position. Stay put. We're guiding you out. The debrief with Monsignor Valerio was the most terrifying meeting of my life. He listened to our report, his face a pale, strained mask. He seemed to absorb the news of the shifting walls and the frosted door with a weary resignation, as if they were merely confirmations of a truth he already knew. But when I described the radio transmission, the whisper, the word, his head snapped up, all pretense of calm shattered, and I saw a raw, primal fear in his eyes. He leaned across the desk, his trembling hands gripping its edge. "The word," he commanded, his voice a harsh, serrated whisper. "Describe it." I couldn't. It was an impossible sound to replicate. When I told him so, he fixed me with a gaze of terrible intensity. "Then you must forget it. You must never speak of it, Silas, not aloud. Not in your thoughts, not even to each other. Do you understand me?" Later, as Vela and I walked in stunned silence across the moonlit piazza, the noise of the living city a world away from the silence below, she finally spoke. Her voice was low, heavy, with a terrible new understanding. "I was wrong about the rules," she said, staring at the great dome of the basilica as if seeing it for the first time. "I thought they were to protect us from what's down there." She turned to me, her eyes dark with the shared horror of our experience. "They're not. The rules don't just protect us from the crypts, Silas. They protect the crypts from us." And in that moment, the entire framework of my fear shifted. We weren't just explorers in a dangerous place. We were potential carriers, vessels who could, by seeing too much or hearing the wrong word, become contaminants ourselves, bringing the madness of that deep, silent darkness out into the light. The word Monsignor Valerio forbade me to speak became a ghost in my mind, an impossible syllable that echoed in the quiet moments. He had effectively quarantined us. Dr. Vela and I were reassigned from the crypts to the surface, confined to the sunlit, public-facing sections of the Vatican archives. We were pariahs, marked by an experience no one was willing to acknowledge. The silence from the Monsignor's office was absolute. We were given meaningless work, collating correspondence from the 19th century, a tedious task designed to keep us occupied and, more importantly, contained. For 2 weeks, the horror of Level 3 was a shared, unspoken weight between us. Then the summons came. We found Monsignor Valerio not in his antechamber, but deep within the archives proper, in a private research room that smelled of aging paper and lemon polish. The air was warm and dry, a universe away from the damp chill below. He looked worse than ever, his skin pale and translucent, his eyes sunk deep into their sockets. He didn't offer pleasantries, he simply gestured to a thin cardboard file on the table. 1987, he said, his voice raspy. A maintenance incident. Before your time, Dr. Vella. The official report lists a gas leak and temporary disorientation of the crew. I opened the file. The top pages were exactly as he described, bureaucratic, sterile, full of technical jargon about atmospheric sensors and ventilation shafts. But beneath them was a second, sealed folder marked Episcopal Medical Review. My hands trembled as I opened it. It was a physician's report on one of the workers, a man named Enzo. He wasn't just disoriented. He had been found in a state of total catatonia, staring at the wall of a supply closet on Level 2. The report detailed his complete unresponsiveness, but it was the photograph clipped to the page that made the air freeze in my lungs. It was a picture of the floor in Enzo's hospital room. In the center, scratched violently into the linoleum, was a tight, inward-curling spiral. The caption noted it had been carved with the patient's own fingernails, all of which were torn and broken. Vella made a soft, choked sound beside me. The symbol was hypnotic and sickening, a vortex of madness etched onto the floor. He never spoke another word, the Monsignor added quietly. He died in that facility 8 months later. Before we could process the horror, he pushed a second, much older ledger across the table. It was bound in cracked black leather, its pages yellow and brittle. "My uncle," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Father Antonio Valerio." This was his private log from his expedition in 1962. I opened the ledger. Father Antonio's script was a stark, elegant hand, but the words it formed told a story of unraveling sanity. He wrote of the same sloping corridor, the same sealed door. He wrote about more than just strange architecture or cold spots. He described what he called contagio perceptiva, perceptual contagion. "The influence does not stay in the rock," one passage read. "It clings to you. It follows you back into the light." For weeks after our return, members of my team reported seeing fleeting shadows in their periphery, hearing whispers that coiled in their ears when they tried to sleep. The crypt gave us a sickness of the senses. My blood ran cold. I read on, my horror mounting with every line. Father Antonio wrote of one man on his team, a geologist, who had been found in his quarters, screaming. He had gouged out his own eyes. When restrained, he only repeated one phrase over and over again, a chilling, desperate mantra. "They showed me the wrong reality." My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the final page. It was a hand-drawn map of Level 3 and the undocumented passage. He had marked the location behind the great stone slab with a single chilling designation, Camera Alpha. Chamber Alpha. And there, next to a crude drawing of what he labeled a central platform inside the chamber, was a small, meticulously sketched symbol. It was the spiral. The same inward-curling, maddening spiral the catatonic worker from 1987 had carved into the floor. The same symbol now burned into my memory. A direct, undeniable link across a quarter of a century. It wasn't a series of isolated incidents. It was a pattern. A recurring psychological plague, anchored to that one sealed chamber, passed down through decades, leaving madness and broken minds in its wake. The pieces were no longer a mystery. They were a diagnosis, and we had just stood at the very door of the asylum. Spiral haunted my sleep. Monsignor Valerio's revelations left Dr. Vella and me in a state of quiet shock, adrift in the mundane world of the sunlit archives while knowing the true, cyclical madness that festered below. The weight of it was a constant pressure behind my eyes. I felt contaminated, as if the whispers from level 3 were still coiled in my ear, waiting for a moment of silence to unspool. A few days after our meeting, Monsignor Valerio informed us, via a sterile internal memo, that he had invoked a protocol that hadn't been used since his uncle's ill-fated expedition in 1962. A full investigation by a specialized team had been formally requested. After that, silence. The weeks that followed were a quiet torment. We cataloged, we translated, we drank bitter coffee in the staff refectory, all under the shadow of a secret that felt like a tumor growing in my soul. We were waiting for the other shoe to drop, knowing it would not be a shoe but a slab of stone. The summons, when it finally came, was delivered not by memo but by a pale-faced acolyte who found us in the reading room and simply said, "The Monsignor requires you. Now." We found him in the gray marble antechamber, the gateway to the crypts. The room was cold, but the chill I felt had nothing to do with the temperature. A digital projector, a starkly modern intrusion in the ancient space, was humming on a small table, casting a bright rectangular light on the far wall. 2 weeks ago, I had a remote seismic sensor and a pressure-sensitive camera installed near the door to Chamber Alpha, Monsignor Valerio said, his voice strained and thin. He gestured to the projector. Last night at 3:13 a.m., the sensor registered a single violent tremor, then it went offline. He clicked a button, and an image flared to life on the wall. My breath caught in my throat. It was the sealed door, or what was left of it. The massive stone slab was shattered, great chunks of it blown outward into the corridor. The force required must have been immense, geological. It looked less like a break-in, and more like the aftermath of a detonation. The locking mechanisms, forged and blessed in the 15th century, were pulverized, the Monsignor whispered, his trembling hand pointing to the jagged edges of the opening. He was focused on the technical failure, the breach of physical security. But my eyes were drawn to something else, something far more horrifying. Just inside the darkened doorway, a shape was branded onto the stone wall. It wasn't a shadow being cast, it was a shadow blasted into the rock itself, a dark, smudged silhouette. It was vaguely human in shape, but distorted, its limbs elongated and twisted as if captured in a moment of excruciating agony. It was the faint, terrible outline left behind when a body is vaporized by an unimaginable release of energy. Someone had been standing there, standing on the inside. A cold wave of nausea washed over me. I said nothing. I knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that to speak of that scorched outline would be to give it a power I could not comprehend. The door to the antechamber opened, and a man I had never seen before stepped inside. He was tall and lean, with a stillness that was unnerving, the stillness of a hunter. His face looked as though it were carved from granite, and his eyes, a pale, piercing gray, seemed to miss nothing. "Dr. Vela, Silas Romano," the Monsignor said, his voice regaining a sliver of composure. "This is Father Lorenzo Corti, our chief of security. He will be leading the team." Corti gave us a curt nod, his gaze analytical, assessing. He carried no sense of the Monsignor's spiritual dread. He was a man who dealt in threats and countermeasures, not in curses and contagion. "You will both accompany Father Corti," the Monsignor continued, turning his haunted eyes back to us. The unspoken reason was clear. We were the only living people who had been to the door and returned sane. We were the guides, the canaries for this new descent. His next words cemented the true nature of our mission. "Your mandate is not simply to investigate the breach," he said, his voice dropping, each word heavy with grim purpose. "Father Corti's instructions are to assess the integrity of the containment and the state of what was contained." The phrase hung in the air, chilling and precise. What was contained? Not who, but what? The word I had heard over the radio, the guttural, inhuman syllable, echoed in my memory. The investigation wasn't about solving a crime. It was about confronting a horror. We weren't going down to find out who broke in. We were being sent to see what had gotten out. The descent felt different this time. We were no longer two scholars creeping into the shadows, but part of a grim procession. Father Lorenzo Corti led the way, his movements precise and economical. He was flanked by two silent professionals from his security detail, men who moved with the quiet confidence of soldiers. Dr. Vela and I followed, feeling less like colleagues and more like living artifacts being brought along for arcane purposes, the ones who had heard the whispers, the ones who had seen the warnings. I was the canary, and we were descending deeper into the mine. Corti was a paradox of the ancient and the modern. He carried a high-lumen tactical flashlight and a sensitive radiation dosimeter, but clipped to his belt, alongside his electronic equipment, were tools of a far older trade: a small flask of holy water, a heavy iron crucifix, and a set of polished silver probes. He was prepared for failures of both technology and faith. The path through the shifting labyrinth of Level 3 was now starkly marked with Corti's phosphorescent wayfinders, a trail of cold green light that tamed the living corridors. When we reached the sloping passage, the silence was just as I remembered, absolute and unnerving. The sight of the shattered door was a brutal violation of the senses. The clean, modern cuts of the security team's exploratory lights fell upon a scene of raw, ancient violence. Great slabs of the dark stone lay scattered like broken teeth. Corti swept his light over the scorched, distorted silhouette on the far wall. "Blast pattern," he murmured, his voice flat, nothing more. But I saw the way his eyes lingered on it, a flicker of something deeper than professional analysis in his gaze. We stepped through the breach into Chamber Alpha. The air inside was stale and cold, and the space was a crime against reason. My mind, accustomed to the logical lines of libraries and cathedrals, struggled to comprehend it. The chamber was circular, but the curve of the walls felt subtly wrong, as if the geometry that held our world together had been bent and warped within these stones. The corners of the ceiling, where they met the walls, seemed to hold more than 90 degrees, an architectural impossibility that made my eyes water and a wave of vertigo roll through my stomach. In the center of the chamber stood a raised circular platform of the same dark stone. Its surface was covered in carved symbols, the dominant one being the inward curling spiral that was now burned into my memory. Staring at them was like looking at an optical illusion designed by a madman. They seemed to shift and squirm at the edges of my vision, inducing a dizzying nausea. But the ancient horror was contaminated by a modern one. A chaotic nest of modern heresy was scattered around the platform: laptops, tangled cables, portable generators, and scientific instruments I didn't recognize. Someone had been here for a long time. They hadn't just broken in, they had set up a laboratory. "Marco, get to work," Corti ordered one of his men, a young technician whose face was already pale. "Find out what they were doing." While the team documented the scene, I felt a terrible pull toward the central platform. It was the source. It was the heart of the sickness that had plagued this place for decades. As Marco worked, his typing a frantic, clicking intrusion in the dead silence, he suddenly gasped. "Father," he stammered, his voice tight with disbelief. "This computer, it's still running. It's a predictive algorithm, based on energy readings from the platform." Corti was at his side in an instant. "A prediction for what?" Marco swallowed hard, his eyes wide as he stared at the screen. "An energy spike, Father. A convergence event. The model forecasts it will be of an unprecedented magnitude." "When?" Vela asked, her voice sharp. The technician turned to us, his face ashen. 3 days from now." A new, more urgent dread filled the chamber. The investigation was no longer about the past. It was about the immediate, terrifying future. As if on cue, Corti, who had been searching through a bag near the platform, held up a small black audio recorder. "Found their logs," he said grimly. He thumbed the device on, and a voice filled the chamber, tinny and laced with static. He fast-forwarded through hours of scientific jargon and mundane observations. Then he found the final entry. The air grew thick with its sound. It began with the terrified, overlapping prayers of at least 3 different voices, desperate and frantic Latin pleas for deliverance. The prayers were cut short by a single blood-curdling scream that was human, followed by a sound that was not. Then came the unmistakable noise of bone splintering, a wet, sickening crack, and a heavy, dragging sound that painted a gruesome picture in the mind. The dragging stopped. For a moment there was only silence. And then, from the speaker, calm and clear, a single, guttural voice spoke the same unknown word I had heard over the radio. The sound scraped against my mind, a physical violation, and I recoiled, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a cry. It was the voice of the thing that had been contained, the thing that was now, terrifyingly, free. The guttural word from the audio log hung in the warped air of Chamber Alpha, an unholy benediction. It was a sound that had no place in the world of men, and its echo in that chamber felt like a final, damning piece of evidence. The investigation was over. The race had begun. Father Cordy's professional composure was a thin veneer over a grim new reality. The question was no longer who had broken in, but what they had awakened. The predictive algorithm on the abandoned laptop was our ticking clock, counting down to an unprecedented event in less than 72 hours. We were no longer investigators. We were standing at ground zero, staring at the clock on a bomb of unimaginable power. We packed up in tense silence, the modern equipment of Corty's team feeling like children's toys in the face of such ancient malice. The wrong geometry of the room seemed to press in on us, eager for us to leave. As we prepared to exit through the shattered doorway, Dr. Vella let out a soft gasp. She was staring at the floor near the edge of the central platform, her face a mask of horrified discovery. "Silas," she whispered, her voice trembling. I followed her gaze. Lying half hidden under a discarded power cable was a single, freshly printed laminated card. It was caked in a dark, flaking substance I knew was dried blood. I recognized the design instantly. It was identical to the identification card issued to every member of the Crypt division. All 5 of our sacred rules were listed in clean, official type. But beneath them, crudely scratched into the plastic with a sharp point, was a 6th rule. The handwriting was a frantic scrawl, born of terror and desperate revelation. 6. Do not let it hear you pray. My blood ran cold. The final audio log replayed in my head. The frantic, overlapping prayers followed by the scream and the splintering of bone. The researchers hadn't been praying for salvation. They had been ringing the dinner bell. Their faith, their last hope, had been the very thing that triggered the final, lethal attack. We had been operating under an incomplete set of instructions, a manual for a threat we didn't truly understand. Our ascent back to the surface was a journey from one reality to another. We emerged from the antechamber's gray stone into the warm, golden light of a Roman afternoon. St. Peter's Square was filled with the familiar sounds of life, the chatter of tourists, the cooing of pigeons, the distant peal of bells, but it all felt like a fragile illusion, a thin, beautiful membrane stretched over a pit of absolute darkness. I looked at the thousands of people milling about under the sun and felt a profound, chilling detachment. They were living in a world that was about to end, and they had no idea. The 5 rules I had memorized, the rules I had clung to as a shield, were a lie, not in their instruction but in their intent. They were designed to protect us from a passive influence, from a place that could drive you mad if you weren't careful. They were rules for handling a contaminated site. We had no rules for this, no protocol for an active, predatory intelligence that listened and learned. No procedure for a malevolent entity that used faith as a lure and prayer as a trigger. This was not a haunting, this was a hunt. Back in the relative safety of the Monsignor's office, the weight of our shared knowledge was a terrible, crushing burden. Father Corti delivered his report with grim efficiency, but his eyes kept flicking to the calendar on the wall. 3 days. The investigation wasn't about solving a mystery anymore. The culprits were dead, their last moments a horrifying testament to their failure. The truth wasn't a question we needed to answer. It was a certainty we now had to face. I looked at Dr. Vella, her face pale, her knuckles white, where she gripped the arm of her chair. I saw my own terror reflected in her eyes. The story wasn't over. We had simply reached the end of the beginning. The clock was ticking, and we were utterly, terrifyingly unprepared for what was coming.